Good evening. Welcome to our final lecture of the semester, which is just so hard to believe. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Karen Kiefer, and I'm the Associate Director of the Church in the 21st Century Center. And this semester, our theme was Living Catholicism. And we were so excited when we had the opportunity to have Gary Anderson here to come speak to us as part of our Advent series. So it really truly was a gift. And I'm so pleased that you could all be here tonight. I just want to let you know how the night will proceed. Gary will also obviously deliver his lecture for about 45 minutes. Then we'll open it up for questions and answers for about 15 minutes. And then we will have Gary's books on sale, so he can also sign your books. There's refreshments, so please, it's casual. Get up and get some sweets and treats. And I have the treat of introducing Father Dick Clifford, who is the legendary professor and master of the Old Testament for the School of Theology and Ministry, and he in turn will introduce Gary. So, without further ado.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have an old friend and a fine and imaginative biblical scholar to address us this evening, even though I think we are approaching exam week when people's minds begin to wander from lectures and begin to wonder about what exams they will have, but it's a great delight to have Gary. Gary is the Hesburgh Professor of Catholic Theology at the University of Notre Dame, and he holds an MDiv from Duke University and a PhD from Harvard. His interests span the entire Bible, and especially the religion and literature of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, and the Bible's reception in early Judaism and Christianity. This is one of his distinctive interests, and he already has published widely in that area of reception. He has recently put special focus on the book of Genesis, as well as priestly literature. These are two issues that have much concerned him over the last few years. He is interested in biblical narrative, canonical exegesis, biblical theology, Jewish culture and religion, as well as Jewish-Christian relations, and he's published in all of those areas. He has been the recipient of numerous awards, including recent grants from the American Philosophical Society, the Lilly Endowment, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Hebrew University. Gary Anderson is the author of the critically acclaimed book called Sin, A History, Yale University Press 2009, which has, I think, a distinctive cover that once you see it, you will never forget. He has also, more recently, and just recently, published a book, Charity, the Place of the Poor in the Biblical Tradition. Again, an imaginative breakthrough, in my opinion, and he illustrates how charity affirms the goodness of the created order. The world was created through charity, and therefore it rewards it. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Gary Anderson.
Thank you, Dick, for that very kind introduction. Your last sentence really summarized the book and the lecture. I suppose we could just stop right here and go home. That is the presumption of the gracious way in which God has created the world generates, by its very nature, a reward to those who act charitably. So having said that, let me begin. It would be difficult to overemphasize the importance of charitable deeds in the Jewish tradition. One need only turn to a Hebrew dictionary in order to learn that the biblical word for commandment, mitzvah, underwent an extraordinary change in the rabbinic period, that is, the period just after the life of Jesus. It retained its base meaning of commandment, but developed the extended sense of almsgiving, reflecting the idea that almsgiving had become truly the commandment with a capital T. The Talmud put this matter quite succinctly when it said, giving alms is equal to keeping all the commandments in the Torah. And I might mention that this linguistic oddity is not restricted simply to the rabbinic dictionary, but it spread into the Christian world as well, whereas in classical Ethiopic, the word mitzvah also means commandment. It appears in Coptic as well as in Greek materials, showing the broad influence of this Jewish idea in early Christianity. The importance of charity is confirmed in the writings of the Roman Emperor Julian, 4th century AD, known as the Apostate. Though raised in a Christian home, at the age of 6, he witnessed the brutal murder of his father and other family members. Forever turned off to the claims of this religion that had only recently become licit, Julian embarked on a campaign to revive traditional Greco-Roman religion. In one of his letters, he exhorts a high priest, pagan high priest, to provide food for the poor in order to combat the success of his Jewish and Christian competitors. And not only does he give the order, but as a sign of the seriousness of his intentions, he also provides the food that is to be distributed. He tells his priest that 1/5 of this is to be used for the poor who serve the priests, and the remainder is to be distributed by us to strangers and beggars. For it's disgraceful that when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans, that is, the Christians, support not only their own poor but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. Now, this is really an extraordinary text, and we shouldn't let it go by without paying attention to what it tells us. All of us, I think, are familiar with reading didactic texts that tell religious persons to do X, Y, or Z from antiquity, and all of us, I'm sure, wonder whether persons from antiquity actually followed the dictates of the texts they claim to revere. This particular letter shows us quite clearly that, at least among pagans of late antiquity, the demonstrable charitable activities of synagogue and church were extraordinarily visible and definite markers of these two monotheistic religions. If we fast forward to our own day, we'll see that though we inhabit a different world than that of Julian's, this particular feature of Judaism and Christianity remains visible for all who would care to see. In their recent book, American Grace, Robert Putnam and David Campbell demonstrate that religious affiliation correlates quite strongly with charitable giving. With the aid of extensive surveys, they provide abundant evidence that religious people far exceed their secular counterparts in terms of donating both time and money. Now, one might be tempted to cast a suspicious eye on these results and wonder if most of this time and money is spent on church or synagogal activity. But as Putnam and Campbell show, though it's true religious people spend a lot of time on specifically religious actions, they're also active participants in non-religious organizations. And in fact, and this certainly came as a surprise to me in reading this book, religious people are more involved in non-religious activities than their secular counterparts. So in sum, religious people are more generous on every level than non-believers. But naturally, the question then would arise as to why this would be the case. And here I have to concede I'm not a social scientist, and I'm not going to pretend this evening that I can even begin to make sense of the impressive pool of data that Putnam and Campbell have assembled. I'm going to stick to what I think I know best, which is the textual world of early Judaism and Christianity, and try to discern from these sources just why it was that early Jews and Christians had such an extraordinary concern for the plight of the poor. Well, let me cut right to the chase in terms of the answer. The answer, I believe, is really quite simple. For Jews, the act of providing for the poor was a form of avodah, the Hebrew word, meaning worship of God. And that's why Julian, in the text we just read, is exhorting his priests to do the same. He wanted pagan lay people in the hinterland to associate the temple with gifts to the poor. Now let's pause for a second to let this particular insight sink in. For most religious persons, I would assume, charity to the poor is often considered a natural outgrowth of their faith, something like the correlation of a good education and success eventually in a career. What is primary, of course, is service to the mind, but it does have some beneficial but still secondary effects, such as advancement in society. But this is precisely what I don't mean when I say that providing for the poor in synagogue and church is avodah. For in both early Jewish and Christian tradition, service to the poor becomes the privileged way to serve God. It's not the secondary aftergrowth, but rather the modality to get into the truth of the religious claims of each tradition. One can see this in one of our earliest sources for the importance of almsgiving, in the Jewish apocryphal, or in a Catholic context, Old Testament book of Ben Sira. Ben Sira lived during the early 2nd century BC in Jerusalem and exhorted his students to take their responsibilities to the altar there with utmost significance. Yet at the same time, he took special care to correlate service of the altar with service to the poor. He writes, "The one who returns a kindness provides a grain offering. The one who gives alms sacrifices a thank offering." The theology that's embedded in these brief lines is very well reflected in a painting from about 1400 by Andrea de Bartolo of Siena. This painting is now on display at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, where I personally viewed it a couple of years ago. And the label on this painting really depicts the problem that attends the study of charity in Christian sources, and what I hope to address in my lecture tonight and in the book I wrote on this subject. For it was labeled by the art historians at this museum, Joachim and the Beggars. And one can see what's significant about this image, and that was the title given to it, and that's what most moderns see. But just as important in this image is the woman standing next to him, Anna, his wife, offering what appears to be a jar of grain to the priests, or the priest singular. So through the hands of this couple, God is served in two ways. One by a direct gift to the poor by Joachim, and secondly, a direct gift to the temple by Anna. In fact, the way the artist has depicted this is quite striking, where they are literally, we might want to say, to employ a colloquial English idiom, joined at the hip. And I think our artist has depicted them this way because they are, in his imagination, a single subject completing a single act. Service to altar, service to poor. And the mislabeling, I think, reflects the modern interest really only in the latter, the help to the poor, and misses the important element of avodah, or service to God, that's so basic to Christian and ultimately Jewish imagination. This image also reflects the same sort of correlation, now here not in an Old Testament modality, but that of the church, where at the top we can see the priest offering the Eucharistic sacrifice, but at the right-hand side we see a man offering, again, bread to the poor, where we have the correlation of both service of altar and service to the poor as correlative activities. It's hard for me not to link this image to an oft-cited homily of St. John Chrysostom, a well-known theologian and preacher who was active in the late 4th century and hailed from Antioch. He begins in the homily I'm thinking of by acknowledging the honor his congregation shows toward the altar in church. The altar is worthy of this veneration, Chrysostom explains, because, quote, it receives Christ's body during the sacrifice of the Mass. But this, Chrysostom goes on to say, is not the only altar found in the city of Antioch. Whenever you see a poor man, he continues, imagine you behold an altar. When you meet a beggar, don't insult him, but reverence him. I think when many people read this, you might think of this as mere rhetorical filigree in the homily. But if we tie it back to Christian tradition, going up to 1400 and back to Ben Sira, the 2nd century, we can see we are in the midst of a very deep theological construal, where service to the poor is a sacramental act that involves one directly in worshiping God. Let's pursue this a little bit deeper. But in order to do this, you're going to have to put your seatbelts on, I'm going to warn you, because we're going to have to focus for a moment on the concept of an altar and the way altars function anthropomorphically in the temple. Anthropomorphically meaning a term in which one depicts the actions of God or where God dwells as though God were simply a human like us. Though most of us have been raised to believe that God is beyond any sort of material need, the concept of a temple requires that we suspend these worries. The temple is the place where God dwells, and as such, he needs a throne for sitting, a lamp for seeing, and an altar where his food is prepared. The altar in the temple functions something like that tube in Star Trek, if you're old enough to remember, where one could be miraculously beamed up from one domain to the other. The altar is that spot where meat, grain, and oil could be directly transported from earth to heaven. Well, what happens when we take this anthropomorphic image that's deeply embedded in priestly literature in the Bible and carry it over to almsgiving? If the altar has the special capacity to be able to convey food to God, then the hand of the poor similarly must be able to transfer funds from earth to heaven. And it must be considered like a form of the altar. Jewish beggars, in fact, in the land of Israel in late antiquity, used to address their potential patrons with the words zechibi, which translates, "Make a deposit to your heavenly treasury through me." And so the idea of a heavenly bank was born, and along with it, the idea that making a deposit to this bank was like making a loan to God, one of the most important images in the patristic period for the charitable activity. Well, let's pause for a second on this image of a loan. As you may recall, the command to assist the poor is expressed in financial terms in the Bible. Here's from the Covenant Code. "When you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act toward them as a creditor. Exact no interest." Help for the poor was understood as a no-interest loan in order to protect the dignity of the poor person, to presume that in the future he or she will have the means to repay and retain their dignity as a human being. Now, Ben Sira, if we skip forward a few centuries, was well aware of this commandment from Exodus, but also appreciated the risks that were embedded in such a responsibility. When considering the problem of those who had become poor by dint of bad luck, he told his students to be wary. Many, he said, will regard this loan as a windfall and cause trouble to those who help them. Though they'll speak deferentially when requesting money, they'll become indignant when repayment is due. And as a result, Ben Sira concluded, many will refuse to lend, not because as people they're basically mean, but rather from a realistic fear of being defrauded by those they wish to aid. So that's how Ben Sira begins. Now, if these words of Ben Sira are true of borrowers, even in the best of circumstances, then logically all of us, I think, would imagine that Ben Sira would be even sterner when he began to address one's responsibility towards the truly down and out. In other words, if this is what he says with respect to people who've simply temporarily fallen on bad luck, then what about those who are truly down and out who most likely will never have the opportunity to repay you? One presumably would never help them. But for Ben Sira, surprise, surprise, the opposite takes place. He commends his students to disperse their funds to the truly poor without a moment's thought. Lose your silver, he says, for the sake of the poor, and lay up your treasure in heaven, for there it will profit you more than gold. Now, this is certainly, or ought to be, a puzzling piece of advice for someone who, in other circumstances, could be quite sober-minded about the risks of making a loan. So our question we certainly would want to ask of Ben Sira is, where does he get this confidence? Why are the truly indigent so worthy of our gratuity? The answer, I think, lies in a rabbinic midrash, that is, a rabbinic interpretation of a biblical text. You have it in your handout. I'll also post it here in a second on the screen. And I might want to mention, we're not going to look at this, but on the other side of the handout, we have almost the same idea in Christian dress from one of the famous Cappadocian fathers, St. Basil. In fact, the similarity between St. Basil and the rabbis on this point are really quite extraordinary. In this particular tradition that I want to address, Rabbi Gamaliel is approached by a Roman citizen and questioned about the rationality of his holy book. Clearly, this Roman citizen, like Julian the Apostate, knows that the Jews care deeply about the poor and is inquisitive as to why this might be the case. He finds it odd that their holy book, specifically the book of Deuteronomy, commands one to give to the poor without a moment's hesitation. This Roman citizen wonders, well, if one acted that way, oneself would be out of money in days, in need of assistance himself. To which Rabbi Gamaliel responds, well, what if a man, and here we're reading from the handout, appeared out of nowhere and asked you for money, would you give him it? And he replied, no. But what if he brought you a deposit as a collateral on the loan? And he replied, well, of course I'd do that. That would eliminate all risk. Okay then, Rabbi Gamaliel continues, what if this potential borrower brought you a commoner to co-sign? And he replied, of course I wouldn't issue the loan. But then he adds, well, what if I brought you the coach of the BC football team? Think of how much he makes. And the Roman patron then says, well, by all means, of course I'll make the loan if the coach of the BC football team is going to co-sign. Prior coach of the BC football team used to be at the University of Virginia as a faculty member, and he was there as an assistant, and his kids played with the neighbors next door, so I have some knowledge of the BC football team, at least at that level. But in any event, if someone of means is going to co-sign, of course, one will be willing to then make the loan. And now we come to the punchline. And this is why we can see why it is that Ben Sira is so serious with respect to the importance of loaning to the truly indigent. Well then, isn't the scriptural commandment then altogether logical? If you'll issue a loan when the mayor himself co-signs, how much more willing should you be when, quote, he who spoke and made the world agrees to co-sign? For scripture itself says, who is generous to the poor makes a loan to God, and God shall surely repay what he owes. In the course of my research, I didn't include this in my book, perhaps a mistake, but I had a graduate student assemble all the times where this is cited in patristic literature, Proverbs 19:17, and there were more texts than one would count. It was actually an extraordinary database that we assembled. At least one dissertation could be written on the importance of this particular biblical verse in early Christian imagination about charity. I can't provide many examples that are going to illustrate this. On the handout, though, I have a couple. Let me read just one of them, one of my favorites, St. Ephraim, a 4th century Christian who lived in eastern Syria and whose native language was the same as that of the Babylonian Talmud, that is Aramaic. He writes this, 2 heroic commandments to love one's neighbor and God. You, here he's talking about a specific Syrian holy man, bore them like a yoke. Between man and God you sowed a beautiful deposit. You listened in order to act. You acted in order to issue a loan. You issued the loan in order to reign. You believed so as to receive, and you received so as to reign. Your alms and prayers are like loans. In every location they enrich those who take them, while to you belongs capital and interest. What you offer as a loan returns to you. The alms of the giver are like a loan that the just give, for it is in the full possession of both borrower and loaner, for it returns to him with interest. And then one last text, which I won't read, but certainly significant, from the Quran, where we see the same notion of loaning or gifts to the poor understood as a loan to God. So what we see from this set of examples is an extraordinary breadth of this tradition, both synagogue, church, and eventually mosque, understanding charity to the poor as a loan to God, and extraordinary chronological depth, beginning with Ben Sira in the 2nd century BC up through the close of the patristic period in the 7th century AD. And the choice, as I've tried to say, for this particular metaphor is grounded in the fact that charity is considered a form of avodah, or serving God. So much for the first 2 points I wanted to make this evening. Charity is a form of direct service of God, and that service has an anthropomorphic character like that of the altar in the temple, where goods are actually transferred from earth to heaven, and here the funds delivered to the poor fund as well a treasury in heaven. But now for a question that I'm sure weighs on the minds of at least some of you in this room, and that is this metaphor of funding a treasury in heaven, even though it was a favorite of Jesus, is this metaphor really worthy of our admiration? When I've shopped this idea around to different focus groups, you can consider yourself here a focus group for the purposes of my informal survey, I've found that the reaction isn't always positive. Many are troubled by the idea that charity to the poor seems to be motivated by blatant self-interest. More than one person has wondered whether these texts I have just put before you do not lead inexorably to the rhetoric of the so-called prosperity gospel. Most people, I think, are far more comfortable with the Jewish sage Antigonus of Soko, who said, quote, "Be not like servants who serve their master on condition of a gift," end of quote. But let me urge caution here before despairing of this tradition. The first thing we need to bear in mind is that these financial metaphors come from the book of Proverbs, and Proverbs, it must be emphasized, vary considerably in meaning depending on the context they imagine. Let's consider, for example, Proverbs 10:2, a very, very important text for understanding Jewish and Christian charity. I would paraphrase this famous text as follows, and this is certainly how this text is heard by Ben Sira and the authors of the New Testament. Material treasuries, you could read IRAs, for example, contrary to what your financial advisor might tell you, in the end really provide no benefit, but rather the treasuries that you fund through charity deliver you from death. The question that stands behind this proverb is how we should prepare for the uncertainties of the future, a universal human concern if there ever was one. Now imagine that by some happy accident you have been made heir to an enormous sum of money. Rather than giving in to the urge to spend it immediately, you ponder how these funds might be invested for your protection against an uncertain future. In front of you are two advisors. Warren Buffett, that's not Dick Clifford, maybe a similarity in gray hair, but I can assure you that's not Father Clifford. Warren Buffett, the famous investment guru from Omaha, and on the left, the Baal Shem Tov, a very famous 18th century charismatic holy man, who, like St. Francis, was famous for emptying his pockets at the end of every day for the poor so that he could start every day afresh, wholly dependent on God. Mr. Buffett speaks of the prospect of a slow but inexorable set of gains over time that will guarantee you a safe future no matter how long you live. The Baal Shem Tov, on the other hand, argues that God created the world out of charity, and as a result, your prosperity in the future is going to depend on you riding those currents. Though it's technically correct, that the Baal Shem Tov would build on your natural tendency for self-preservation, the suggestion he's making to fund a treasury in heaven, I think, can hardly be considered self-interested in the simple sense of the term, right? Imagine yourself at your kitchen table. You have a financial advisor and a saint. And the one tells you to buy index funds, and the other one says to go down to the corner and give it all away. The giving it all away, he says, is going to assure you a good future. But I think if you're saying that that's self-interest, well, I think we're not on the same page as to what self-interest is about. Loaning to God in this fashion, and this is why I think this image was so important to synagogue and church, might better be conceived as a means for the believer to put his money where his mouth is. I'd like to suggest that this way of reading these Proverbs provides us, I think, with a deeper set of insights than those of Antigonus of Soko. For however salutary it may be to serve a master without thought of a reward, and that is a salutary notion, to be sure, I'm not denying that, most of us, I think, though, would want to know what kind of master we're called to serve that would merit that sort of dedication. There is, I would like to suggest, a deeper human desire to know and believe that the world is formed and guided by charity, and that giving to one's neighbor is not just a Kantian duty, but is at the same time a declaration about the metaphysical structure of the world itself. Charity, in short, then, in this view, is not just a good deed. That's why the language of altruism, though it's an important language for dissecting the character of the moral agent, I concede that, but it's not an all-sufficient category for understanding what the Bible wants to say about charity. Charity is not just a good deed, but it's a declaration of belief about the nature of the world God has created. And so that's my third point for the evening, and now you have it all. Avodah, service to God. Avodah through the means of making a loan to God, and the importance of both those elements consisting in the declaration they make about the nature of the world God has created. You can embark on what seems to be an irrational venture of assisting the poor with the confidence it really will reward you in the end because you're swimming with the tides of the world God has made. So let me say a little bit more on this point. We've seen that a gift to the poor is imagined as a loan to God. In conventional economic circumstances, making a loan involves a risk. As I wrote this book, as providence would have it, luck would have it, depending on whether you're a believer or a non-believer, we were undergoing one of the greatest financial crises since the Great Depression. When my wife and I refinanced our home in the midst of this debacle, our lender gathered all kinds of information about our financial holdings, the status of our employment, the value of our home, and even the nature of our neighborhood. The reason for doing all of this was to assess the risk they were going to undertake. For when they make the loan, and this is very important, they're not only expressing a faith in us, but they're acting on that faith. Or stated somewhat differently, by making this loan, they're making a statement about the neighborhood we live in and the type of people we are. It's not by accident that individuals and banks who make loans are called creditors. Creditor comes from the Latin credere, to believe, as we know from its cognates, creed, creedal, credible, incredible, credulous, and so forth. Creditors are fittingly called believers because they, quote, put their money where their mouth is. It's never enough for a banker just to say he believes you. The customer who's applying for a loan wants to know whether the belief has teeth and will issue in a deed. As the Epistle of James puts it, faith without works is dead. Literally, in the bank, it's dead if you don't get the money. So also for charity to the poor. Why is it, one might ask, that the life of Mother Teresa moved so many people? And not just Christians, but Muslims, Hindus, Jews, and even non-believers. I would suggest that her popularity rests in the fact that she enacted a sort of faith that most of us can only dream of. But I would also want to contend that it's not just admiration for her faith that attracts our attention, but equally important is the statement that her life makes about the character of the world. Though all appearances might suggest that it's Wall Street that makes the world go round, saints like Mother Teresa make a powerful counterclaim. In serving the poor, they not only provide concrete help to the down and out, but they reveal to us the hidden structure of the universe. Steven Pinker, the famous scholar from Harvard, once expressed dismay that the world showers such esteem on Mother Teresa in light of the far greater good that Bill and Melinda Gates have done. Gates, Pinker writes, and here's the quote at the bottom of the slide, crunched the numbers and determined that he could alleviate the most misery by fighting everyday scourges in the developing world like malaria, diarrhea, and parasites. Now, Pinker never explains how he knows that the Gates established their foundation on such utilitarian considerations. Perhaps the Gates' motivations were quite different. But in the remarks that are going to follow, I want to be clear that I don't want to cast any shadow on what the Gates have accomplished. I'm in awe of what they've done. My beef for the moment is going to be the commentary Pinker is going to provide on the Gates and Mother Teresa. That's my focus, Pinker, not the Gates. Let me begin by suggesting that utilitarian value is not the only index for measuring the accomplishments of charity. For however much the Gates might give away, and let's imagine them giving away $25 billion, probably not an unrealistic expectation. They may indeed give away much more than that. But however much they give away, their daily life remains, by and large, unaffected. They're going to still be one of the wealthiest couples in all of America. Mother Teresa, on the other hand, gave up everything she had to serve the poorest of the poor. Her total and unreserved trust, to quote Rabbi Gamaliel, has been put in, quote, he who spoke and the world was created, end of quote. A truly impressive enactment of faith, if there ever was one. Pinker wisely concedes that it's unlikely that his praise for the Gates, or his article he wrote in the New York Times Magazine, is going to win more admirers for the Gates than those of Mother Teresa. But this, he claims, is because our heads can be turned by an aura, as he puts it, of sanctity, distracting us from a more objective reckoning of the actions that make people suffer or flourish. Mother Teresa, he asserts, was the very embodiment of saintliness, white-clad, as though he was actually looking at this slide, sad-eyed, ascetic, and often photographed with the wretched of the earth, as though this was just a photo op rather than a description of Mother Teresa's inward being. This is truly an amazing reduction of the supreme gift she gave the world. When she started her religious order, the entire premise of the organization was the gift of one's total self to the poor. When the order succeeded, she wouldn't accept endowments of the order for precisely this reason. She wanted to be wholly dependent on God. One well-educated Indian professor of the sciences, when asked about her admiration for Mother Teresa, said, "I am an unbeliever, but I feel I need an anchor. Mother Teresa is that anchor." Let me reiterate, I'm not by any means belittling the accomplishment of the Gates Foundation. It's certainly extraordinary, equal to, if not exceeding, what anything I would claim to do. What I've tried to do in the last minute or two, though, is to explain why an Indian professor of the sciences, an unbeliever like Pinker, might find in Mother Teresa an anchor for her life. What I've tried to suggest is the affection for Mother Teresa can't be explained solely on the basis of utilitarian calculations, the sort of explanation that Pinker prefers. Rather, the generosity of Mother Teresa like the generosity of St. Francis or the Baal Shem Tov, becomes praiseworthy because it's a statement made about the nature of the world God has created. Whether we're believers or unbelievers, I think it's fair to say that most of us want an account of human goodness that goes deeper than utilitarian calculation. We do want to believe that the world is good, and that because it's good, in the long run, will reward a life of charity. The holy men and women of synagogue, church, and mosque help us to do just that. And that is the deep reason, I believe, why the financial metaphor of funding a treasury in heaven was so significant for ancient Jews and Christians. The issue wasn't, I do this for my own benefit, but I do this as a way of making or seeing a statement of the gratuitous love with which God has made the world. The important point was not so much what individual agents would gain from their charitable acts, but rather what those acts would say about the character of the God who made the world we live in. So let me conclude. We began with a quotation from Julian the Apostate regarding the striking fact that Jews and Christians were generous to the poor. This led to our first question: what might explain their motivation? Our answer was simple. Service to the poor was service to God. The poor became walking altars wherein one could meet God. This led to a second question. What precisely does this analogy mean? I suggested that just as the altar in front of the temple served to transfer food from heaven, so the hand of the beggar with respect to coins. Jewish beggars, we observed, addressed their patrons with the words, "Make a deposit to your heavenly bank account through me." Or we could skip ahead to post-Reformation Europe, very famous saint from Spain, St. John of God, who addressed potential donors to the church by saying, "Do a favor for yourself." Then came the third and most important question. Is such a mercantile metaphor really appropriate to the religious life? I suggested that behind this metaphor resides the image of debtor and creditor. When one gives to the poor, one becomes a creditor vis-a-vis God. And every creditor I've taken pains to point out is at base a believer. Loaning goods to the poor expresses a belief about God, who stands behind those loans, and it's a statement about him and the world he's created. It's not a world that's governed by those who hoard their goods in hope of a better tomorrow, but rather it's governed by those who believe the future is best secured by sharing their goods with those in need. That's really the punch of Proverbs 10:2. This is the reason I have suggested that figures like Mother Teresa or the Baal Shem Tov will always have more cachet as public icons than figures like Bill and Melinda Gates, which I reiterate is not to demean their accomplishment, but merely to make an argument as to why they have not gotten the same reverence in the wider public. Pinker thinks this is because the wider public has been duped by Mother Teresa's aura, as he puts it, of sanctity, and as a result fails to make a more objective reckoning of what's been accomplished. What I have tried to suggest is that human beings want more than just a calculus of material accomplishment to point the way to charitable life. We want, the German term is a Weltanschauung, a view of the world that provides us with an anchor to live in this world. Charity to the poor, I have tried to suggest this evening, in its classic Christian sense, is that anchor. Thank you.